All right, shalom, folks. I wanted to talk a little bit about a video that I listened to yesterday and then went back and watched a little bit. This is from Dr. Bart Ehrman's new podcast. It's called the Misquoting Jesus podcast. You can watch all of the current episodes or up to the current date online on YouTube. It's a fascinating podcast. Sometimes he's interviewed. Sometimes he interviews other biblical scholars, and I ran across this a couple of days ago, and I saw that one of the episodes from just a few days back, I believe, to when I'm recording this video, he was talking with a biblical scholar, Dr. Jeffrey Siker, and he teaches or taught, maybe still teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary. He has a PhD. And they were talking about homosexuality. So I have listened and watched several lectures and videos over the years. And so I thought, well, let me look at this. Let me listen to this and see what they say. Let me see if they say something that I've heard said many times. And it'll be a good response video to do and talk about it from not just a Christian perspective, but also a pro-Torah or pronomian perspective. I can come at this from a different angle than most Christians today. Not that I'm the only guy that can come at it from this angle, but when you are pro-Mosaic law, in other words, you believe that the law of Yahweh that he gave through Prophet Moshe is still applicable to believers in Christ, and that we ought to live by that law, then you come at this subject from a little bit different angle than most Christians, especially when you are presented with a very common argument that pro-homosexual scholars present. I'm going to pull this up, and we're not going to play it from the start. We're going to bring in their discussion when they're about to talk about Leviticus 18. Dr. Siker has just mentioned that there are like 6 passages in the Bible. Sometimes they're called clobber passages by people because they claim that fundamental or conservative Christians use them to clobber people who are gay or who believe that the Bible does not condemn homosexual practice. But Leviticus 18 is one of them. And I could spend, a couple hours going through every single point in the video, but I just want to cover their discussion on Leviticus chapter 18. So we will start it right here, and I'll pause as I'm able.
All right. So, I think there are a lot of people who are going to be very interested in sort of Christian attitudes and what happens in denominations these days. And a lot of people are just interested in what the Bible says. And I think a lot of people are going to say that, look, the Bible's, it's pretty clear. And so you know the passages better than I do, but especially the people point to these 2 verses in the book of Leviticus.
Leviticus, right.
So Leviticus 18:22. So let me just read it to you so you can't
go for it.
Wiggle out of this.
Yep. I'll wiggle.
It says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Okay. And then 2 chapters later, so it's an abomination for a man to lie with a man. And then the 2 chapters later, in chapter 20, verse 13, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them.
Pretty serious.
That sure sounds like the Bible's condemning homosexuality.
Well, again, you have to ask, what are they talking about? And the context is crucial. So the context of both of these passages in Leviticus is what's called the Holiness Code. And this is instructions given to the people as they're getting ready to go into the land, the promised land that God has given them. And basically, God is saying, don't do the things that the people who I'm kicking out of the land, don't do the things that they did, because it was idolatrous and against my law.
So right here at the start, I have to stop this for just a second. Bart Ehrman appears to understand Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20 verse 13 for exactly what it says. And then Dr. Siker talks about the context of Leviticus 18, and he's right. They're going to be entering into the land later on, the end of Deuteronomy, beginning of the book of Joshua. And he tells them, I think it's at the end, it's at the beginning and the end. So there's bookends in Leviticus 18. Don't practice the customs of the nations. And Leviticus 18 is primarily about various sexual immoralities. You can start off by looking at laws against incest, and then it'll talk about bestiality, laws against laying with animals. It'll talk about a law against laying with one's wife when she is on her menstrual cycle. And it'll talk about a law against adultery, taking another man's wife. And then in the midst of that is this law against homosexual practice. Let's go over here to the Bible and let's look at Leviticus 18, verse 22. And this is parallel. See if I can enlarge this. Yeah. So this is parallel. Look at Leviticus 18:22. And what I have here is the Brenton Septuagint, and thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman, for it is an abomination. Good News Bible. This is more of a paraphrase, but I like to use it as a comparative. It says, no man is to have sexual relations with another man. God hates that. That's very plain translation there. The Literal Standard Version. This is a good new translation of the Bible that's come out fairly recently. And if you want to get more of a word for word formal equivalent Bible, this is a good one to have on your eSword module. And you do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abomination. And then the New English translation which is kind of middle of the road. You must not have sexual relations with a male as one has sexual relations with a woman. It is a detestable act. And so here's a comparative chart of 4 good translations of the Bible. And we see that it's very plain. Dr. Ehrman has said, people are going to read this and say, what do you make of this verse? And he says that because he knows that the verse is plain. I think Dr. Siker also knows that the verse is plain. So how do they get around the verse? Well, the answer is they believe that the law of Moshe, the Torah, doesn't have any applicability for people in modern times. The exact same argument that you hear Christian pastors teach from behind their pulpit. The law has been done away with, and so now we go by the standard of just love or Christ or love God and love your neighbor, and we don't need to really pay attention with all those laws, because if you're going to obey or claim that we have to obey one of them, then you're going to have to claim that we have to obey all of them.
And the difficulty is that there's no rationale given for the prohibition. They're just prohibitions, one with a rather severe punishment, but there are all kinds of other prohibitions, against wearing garments made of 2 different materials, sowing 2 different kinds of seed in the same field, getting a tattoo, shaving your beard into a point. And so
Okay, so he lists several laws in the law code, the Mosaic law code, the law that Yahweh gave through prophet Moshe. We need to always make sure we understand it's okay to refer to the law as the law of Moses, or Moshe more correctly. But that doesn't mean that Moshe gave a law out of his own mind. It means that he was the vessel, or he was the agent. Remember, he's the one that spent 80 days and 80 nights fasting up on top of the mountain where heaven met earth. Yahweh descended and he communed there and had fellowship with Yahweh. So that's very special. It's very unique. To speak against Prophet Moshe was to speak against Yahweh, not because he was Yahweh, but because he was the agent and the emissary. We see this in Numbers with the rebellion of Korah. We see this even with Aaron and Miriam in Numbers chapter 12 as well, how that you do not speak against the prophet. It says, I think it's in Exodus 14, verse 31, where at the end there, after they crossed the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea, that it is said that the people believed, Aman in Hebrew, where we get the word amen. They believed in, they held fidelity to Yahweh and his servant Moshe. And so you could not worship Yahweh without revering and honoring Prophet Moshe. That came as a package deal. To reject Moshe was to reject Yahweh. So that's why the law is called the law of Moshe. It's not coming from his mind. It's that Yahweh used him as that vessel. So here, Dr. Siker mentions these laws. He says, look, there's other laws mentioned in the law code too, the Holiness code, specifically in the book here of Vayikra or Leviticus. And the first one he mentions is the most popular one that always gets brought up. I think it's Leviticus 19:19, about not wearing a garment of two kinds of material. And this is reiterated in Deuteronomy 22, verse 11, I believe. I don't think they understand this law properly. The law actually only forbids what's called a linsey-woolsey garment, a garment mixed of wool and linen. And it's not because it was an altogether forbidden garment. If you study the Jewish sources, in particular the Aramaic Targums and the writings of Flavius Josephus, you'll see that those garments were particularly for the tabernacle and the priesthood. And so the common person in Israel was not allowed to put upon themselves a garment mingled of wool and linen. He also mentions other various laws. I may not remember them all, but he mentions the shaving of the beard. If you'll notice, I have a full beard, and the reason I do is because Leviticus 19:27b, I think, or maybe a, we could look it up, but right there in the verse it says, "Thou shalt not mar," which means to destroy, to rot, to decay, to corrupt the borders or the corners or the sides of your beard. And so if you study the word corners or sides, it refers to the outline that forms the image. So it would be against having a goatee or shaping the beard or anything like that. So we see all through the Bible a doctrine of a man's beard. There's even one Aramaic Targum of Deuteronomy 22:5 that says that a man should not shave his face to look like a woman. Whereas in our modern translations, it says a man shall not wear the clothing of a woman, right? Well, one of the ways that was interpreted anciently was that a man was trying to look feminine if he shaved his face. So Dr. Siker mentions that surely we're not going to go by that law. That's kind of the vibe that he's putting across. Surely we're not going to go by the law of mixing the garments, or oh, Lord forbid that we would not tattoo our bodies, because Leviticus 19 there towards the end, I think it's verse 28, mentions against not making print marks, or some Bibles say tattoos on your body, which I don't do. I believe that the law forbids the making of a tattoo on your body. So the point here is that Dr. Siker is saying, and I've heard this argument so often, and this is the argument that Ehrman and Siker are going to present, is we can't say that the law against homosexual practice is still binding and forbidden for people to do, because if we abide by that, then we have to abide by the other laws in the Holiness Code. Now, there's more to it than that, but I want to pick it back up. Let's listen to what they say next.
Looks like the condemnation is of various practices of the people who preceded them in the land. And so there's a generic just kind of condemnation of don't do those kinds of things.
Okay.
So especially mixing different things.
Mixing different things.
Mixing two different things together.
So let me just ask it: which is forbidden? Shaving your beard into a point, or not shaving it into a point?
Yeah, that would matter to you, wouldn't it?
Well, you got any facial hair, you got to know these things. So, right, okay. So the idea then is what you're saying. Then, I mean, you're admitting that this says that men should not sleep with men, but you're
Yes.
saying you're also not supposed to wear a sweater that's also made of cotton and polyester or something because.
Well, and that's the difficulty. How do you pick and choose?
Okay. Oh man, I hope you're following along with this. Ehrman just said, so you're admitting that the text says men should not sleep with men. They're nodding their head, they're agreeing. But then Ehrman says, yeah, but it also says not to wear this garment of mixed material. Now they misinterpret the part about the garment of mixed material. I went over that. But their point is that if you're going to abide by this law, why do you not abide by the other ones in the Holiness Code? What gives you the right to pick and choose? This is exactly what we tell Christians today. Now, Christians come up with, modern Christians, I consider myself a follower of Christ, a follower of the Messiah, which is the base meaning of the word Christian. But modern, a lot of times Christian in name only, nominal Christianity, they'll come up with these excuses like, well, homosexual practice is condemned also again in the New Testament. In order for a law to be binding today, it needs to be mentioned again in the New Testament. And I could go over many laws that aren't mentioned again in the New Testament, but one of them is the law against bestiality, the law against laying down with an animal. It's confusion. It's not mentioned in the New Testament. So if we're going to go by the rule that something has to be reiterated in the New Testament, what about bestiality? Well, Matthew, see, it's covered under the broad heading of porneia, sexual immorality, the Greek word porneia. Now, see, when you do that, when you start saying, well, it's covered under the broad heading, then at that point, I can say, well, remember the Sabbath day is covered under the broad heading of loving Yahweh with all your heart. You see, it kind of backfires on them, the modern Christians. So they use all these arguments, but the fact of the matter remains that the answer, the only answer, brothers and sisters, the only consistent answer to the pushing of the homosexual agenda is to recognize Yahweh is the creator, Yahweh is the sovereign, Yahweh is the lawgiver, and what he says goes. And so when somebody comes to me, let's say I'm talking with somebody, that's in college and is learning these things from an atheist or agnostic professor, and they're saying, well, this and that about homosexual practice, and these guys aren't consistent when they bring up Leviticus 18. If they talk to me, I have a consistent form of argumentation, because when they say, well, are you wearing a mingled garment of wool and linen? And I say, no. Well, are you marring the borders of your beard? No. Um, are you putting tattoo marks on yourself? No. Are you eating rabbit and pork, which is also called an abomination in Leviticus 11? No, I'm not. I abide by the dietary laws. Are you keeping Sabbath? Yes, I abide by the Sabbath laws, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. So it's a consistent argumentation. So they lose that particular argument. It no longer holds any weight when they talk with someone like me, because I have a lifestyle that is consistent in my practice with the law of Yahweh that he gives through Prophet Moshe.
And Jesus says in Matthew, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law, and whoever relaxes the least of these commandments will be least in the kingdom. Well, the rabbis had rather serious disagreements. In fact, one of the most interesting disagreements the rabbis had.
I have to stop it right there. He quotes Matthew 5:17 through 19 in part, which is, to me, is the Shema of the Newer Testament. So as Deuteronomy 6:4 through 9 is to the Tanakh, Matthew 5:17 through 19 is to the Brit Chadashah, or the Newer Testament. Yeshua says, do not think Don't assume. If you break the Greek down there, it's don't even begin to think. Don't even start thinking that I came to destroy the law. Then he says a second time, I've not come to destroy, but to fulfill. It's interesting that the Christian explanation of that is often somehow that through fulfilling it, he did actually destroy it, because that's what they come up with. But Yeshua said we're not supposed to think that he came to destroy it. He came to do something the opposite of that. And fulfill is probably better translated as to establish or to confirm or to fully preach or to properly interpret, because he's contrasting his interpretation with the interpretation of the scribes and Pharisees that he mentions in verse 20. And Yeshua is talking about the righteousness and the acts of the people. He's not talking about himself fulfilling a prophecy or anything like that. He's saying in his teachings, in my teachings, I've come to give you the proper understanding and the proper interpretation of the laws, because in verses 1 through 16, right there in Matthew 5, it's all about the people that are listening, the disciples that are listening. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Let your light so shine among men, so that they may see your good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. Don't think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. So it's in that vein that he's saying this. And so therefore, verse 19, whoever relaxes, luo in the Greek, whoever loosens one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But if you practice and do them, you'll be called great. Yeshua was a teacher of Torah. Yes, Torah had been manipulated, twisted, and a lot of the oomph and a lot of the reality and truth of it had been diminished because of the traditions of the elders, the traditions of men, whether it be Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, or Zealots. And so Yeshua had to kind of give us a fresh take on Torah, but it wasn't anything that violated what Yahweh had already spoken through prophet Moshe. Yeshua actually is, Deuteronomy 18, Acts 3, the prophet like Moshe that Yahweh raised up from among the brothers of Israel. So it's not that Yeshua is unlike Moshe. No, he's the prophet like Moshe, whom Yahweh places words in his mouth. So it's interesting that he mentions Matthew 5, 17 through 19. I'm not exactly sure why he did, but it's very interesting that he mentions it there.
About these Old Testament passages. So it sounds like you're agreeing that, look, the law of Moses says a man's not supposed to sleep with a man, but it also says, this thing about not sowing your field, you're not supposed to put both barley and wheat in the same field, or, yes. and there are these other things about, pointed beards and things that nobody really thinks apply today.
No, if you're watching this, there are people that think that these do apply. And we do practice them in our life. And we're not flawless in the Torah, but we live, my family, several people in the congregation that I pastor, several people around the world that I'm friends with on social media, do our best to practice these commandments. And so, yeah, the argument is not from Bart and Jeffrey here, Dr. Ehrman, Dr. Siker. The argument is not that Leviticus 18 is not plain. Leviticus 18, 22, and 2013 say what they say. That's just not for us today. And if a person who is gay or who practices homosexuality brings that up to a modern day Christian who doesn't keep Sabbath, who doesn't abide by the dietary laws, even though they claim to be in covenant with the mighty one of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the gay atheist actually has a good argument if they're arguing with that type of a Christian. They do, because the Christian is inconsistent. They want to pick and choose parts of the law that they want to obey and do away with the parts that they don't like or, don't really feel like they should have to obey. So it's very eye-opening. I think they say a few more things. Let me play this and just see.
Exactly. And so the problem is that people, ignore 4/5 of the law or more as not being relevant.
That's the problem.
But they pick the one thing that they personally have an opinion about that so they use the Bible to support their view, even though they're actually not saying the Bible's authoritative. They're just picking the one they want. Is that
well? And it's a non-contextual reading of the Bible, both historically, culturally, and also just. I mean, if you look at the passages, all you have to do is look at the passage just before and the passage just after, and you end up, as you say, cherry picking. Yeah, this doesn't apply. This does apply. And the question is, what kind of rationale is there?
I have a lot of students, and you probably did too, who Christian students who will tell you that what do you think of the law of Moses? And they say, well, I keep the Ten Commandments, but that's I just think the Ten Commandments apply. But then you ask them, okay, have you ever had a job on a Saturday? Oh yeah. But that's against the Ten Commandments. You can't work on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
So they keep the 9 commandments. So even with the
So Bart makes an excellent point here. And Bart is one of my favorite atheists. He makes the point that some of his students in college tell him that they keep the 10 Commandments. They may not abide by the whole law, but they keep the 10 Commandments. And then he throws out the Sabbath commandment to them, and they don't keep the Sabbath. And Bart believes Sabbath is on Saturday, and I would take issue with that. But besides the point, his point is that he tells his student then, you only keep the 9 commandments, right? And he chuckles. And it's funny because it's true. They're inconsistent. People say that they believe in the 10 commandments, but when you come to the 3rd commandment about honoring Yahweh's name and the 4th commandment about keeping the Sabbath day holy, they balk on that. People don't want to use, speak, or revere the actual name, the 4 letters, the tetragrammaton of the Creator, which is part of the 3rd commandment. And then the 4th commandment, they don't want to keep the day that he establishes holy, the 7th day of the week. So Bart's right. They're inconsistent in that. Let's continue on.
10 Commandments, like they're picking. And the thing is, if people want to quote these verses from Leviticus to condemn same-sex relations, why aren't they condemning people who are wearing sweaters and people who are?
Exactly.
I mean, it's because they just want an authority, and they find one rather than actually trusting the authority for what it says altogether. Mm-hmm. So okay, fair enough.
I do want to make a point how that. Let me pull my eSword back up on Leviticus 18, and you'll notice right here at the beginning, Yahweh speaks to Moshe, speak to the sons of Israel. Verse 3, you do not do according to the work of the land of Egypt in which you have dwelt. This is the literal standard version. And you do not do according to the work of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, and you do not walk in their statutes. You do my judgments, and you keep my statutes to walk in them. I am your mighty one, Yahweh. Now, down here at the end of the text, after he gives all of the sexual immoralities, he says here in verse 24, Leviticus 18:24, do not defile yourselves with all these, for with all these the nations have been defiled, which I am sending away from before you, and the land is defiled, and I charge its iniquity on it, and the land vomits out its inhabitants, and you have kept my statutes and my judgments, and do not do any of all these abominations, the native and the sojourner who is sojourning in your midst. For the men of the land who are before you have done all these abominations, and the land is defiled. So what we see right here is that Yahweh is holding heathen pagan nations accountable to certain aspects of the law. Leviticus 18 is all about sexual immorality, what we would call in English maybe fornication or adulteries, porneia in the Greek. But he's holding the Canaanites. He's saying they have committed these abominations. And what we see in the Torah itself is, yes, there are certain distinguishing characteristics if you watch and look how the Israelites live. So like, Yahweh doesn't hold the Canaanites accountable for keeping Shabbat or keeping the feasts or the dietary laws. These are distinctives where that when you join to serve Yahweh, when you join the nation of Israel, if you're a sojourner or a stranger, then you adopt the practices of their mighty one. But there are certain laws, like homosexual practice or bestiality or adultery, or we can get into murder and theft and things like that, that Yahweh even holds pagan nations accountable to. Okay. The problem here is that Christians claim to be in covenant with the Almighty. And remember, he's the Almighty of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the Almighty of Moshe. He's the Almighty of Yehoshua, son of Nun, the successor of Moshe. See, so when you attach yourself to that Almighty, you then have to learn, and he's patient. He gives you time to grow, but you have to learn the practices that the Almighty gives to his people. Because when you join, you're no longer a foreigner, you become an honorary Israelite. End of Exodus 12 talks about this, that a person shall be as one native or born in the land. Let me fast forward to the end of this talk here with Ehrman and Siker.
Okay, so Jeff, we need to end now. Can you just kind of summarize your views? About the Bible condemning homosexuality?
All right. Well, to summarize, there are 6 passages in the Bible that deal in some way, shape, or form with same-sex relations. 3 in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, 3 in the New Testament. The Genesis 19, Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy 1. The Genesis 19 passage is talking about sexual violence and rape. The Levitical passages are quite explicit in condemning same-sex sex between men, but the larger context of the Holiness Code makes it difficult to say, yes, these should be interpreted literally because of all the other things that are condemned that we have no problem with.
So to wrap it up, he's basically just reiterating what he said before, and maybe I'll eventually do a video going over their whole discussion. It's really a fascinating discussion, and you can kind of see some of the angles that they're coming at, and be able to give better argumentation to the scholarship that exists in this day and time in this field. But I think that this one point on Leviticus 18 shows that there are a group of people in the world today known as pro-Torah, pro-law, people who believe, yes, in the promised Hebrew Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth, but also adhere to the Torah of Moshe. People who are akin to an early AD group called the Nazarenes, mentioned in Acts 24, verse 5. There are people like that in the world. I'm one of them, and we have a consistent argumentation when somebody brings that up to us when we present Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 to them. So until next time, I do appreciate you for watching. I hope that this has been beneficial to your studies, and may Yahweh bless you and keep you according to his will for the good. Shalom.